The morning he drove to the shelter, he had a plan, a modest, reasonable plan, the kind a man makes when he's grown tired of coming home to a house that doesn't make a sound. He wasn't looking for anything complicated. He wasn't looking for a project, or a challenge, or something that would test him. He just wanted a dog, something to walk in the morning, something that would be glad to see him. He hadn't expected that the most significant thing to happen to him in years would be waiting quietly in a corner cage, watching him with amber eyes that didn't blink. He was in his early 60s by then, retired or close to it. His kids were grown and scattered across the country in the way kids tend to do. Good lives, busy lives, lives that didn't leave much room for long phone calls. His wife had passed 3 years before, and the silence she left behind was the kind you never quite fill, no matter how many small routines you build around it. Coffee in the morning, the evening news, a walk around the neighborhood that used to feel like exercise and now just felt like passing time. He wasn't depressed exactly, he was just waiting for something to matter again. He thought a dog might help with that. The shelter was a low brick building off a county road about 40 minutes from his house, not a famous place, not one of those bright, modern facilities with a website and a donation page. Just a working shelter, the kind run on underfunding and quiet dedication, where volunteers came in on weekends and staff worked long hours for reasons that had nothing to do with money. He'd called ahead. They had several dogs available. A yellow lab mix, a few terriers, a hound that an older couple had surrendered when they moved into assisted living. He had a list in his mind, calm, medium size, already house-trained if possible, something that would settle easily into the rhythm of a quiet life. He signed in at the front desk and followed a volunteer down the main hallway, past the kennels where the dogs pressed close to the chain link, and barked with that full-body urgency that dogs have, every single one of them trying to be chosen, trying to be seen. It should have been overwhelming. In some ways it was. He stopped at a few of them, let them sniff his hand through the fence, tried to feel something that told him this one. The lab was sweet but young, too much energy, he thought. The hound had kind eyes but leaned against the fence with the sad, slow weight of an animal that had already given up expecting much. He stood there longer than he meant to with that one. It was on his way back toward the front office that he saw it. Not it, her, though he didn't know that yet. She was in a separate enclosure toward the rear of the building, away from the main dog runs, in a quieter section he hadn't noticed at first. A bobcat, young, maybe 8 or 9 months old, the volunteer explained, found injured near a rural highway after what was likely a car strike. She had healed well, physically, but she had been in human care during a critical window of her development, and releasing her now would have been a death sentence. She wasn't domesticated, she wasn't a pet, but she wasn't fully wild either, not in the way a bobcat needs to be to survive. The shelter was licensed to house her while they figured out next steps, a sanctuary placement, most likely, if the right one came through. He stood at the edge of her enclosure and looked at her, and she looked back at him. She wasn't doing what the dogs had been doing. She wasn't pressing forward, wasn't vocalizing, wasn't performing need. She was sitting near the back of the space, perfectly still, her tufted ears angled slightly forward and her eyes, those wide, pale amber eyes, fixed on him with an expression he couldn't name, not fear. She wasn't flattened, wasn't hissing, wasn't positioning herself to flee, not aggression either, just attention, a quality of focus he hadn't seen in an animal before, or maybe hadn't noticed. It felt less like the look of an animal checking for danger and more like something deliberate, like assessment. He stood there longer than made sense. The volunteer said something, offered to show him back to the dogs, mentioned the lab again, and he nodded and said yes, of course, and started to turn away. And then he stopped, because the bobcat had moved, not dramatically, just a few feet closer to the front of the enclosure, still sitting, still, but closer, and still watching him. He turned back. He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted inside him. Not a decision, not yet, but the first small loosening of the plan he'd walked in with. A plan that had seemed, until about 60 seconds ago, entirely reasonable. He couldn't have explained what he felt standing there. He didn't try to. He just noticed it, That quiet, specific feeling of being seen by something that had no obligation to see you. He told the volunteer he'd like to ask a few questions, not about the lab. He didn't choose her that day. He went home without her, told himself it was impractical, told himself he knew nothing about bobcats, their needs, their instincts, the kind of space and patience they required. Told himself he had gone there for a dog, a simple, manageable dog. He made dinner that night, sat in his chair, watched the news, and couldn't stop thinking about those eyes. He went back the next day, told himself it was just to ask more questions, to be responsible, to gather information before making any kind of decision. The staff seemed a little surprised to see him. The volunteer who'd shown him around pulled out what paperwork they had, care notes, feeding records, behavioral observations. He read through all of it slowly, standing at the front desk like a man trying to talk himself out of something he'd already decided. She was in the same spot when he walked back to her enclosure, and the moment he came close, she moved toward him, not rushing, not dramatic. Just that same slow, deliberate repositioning, closing the distance between them like it was the most natural thing in the world, like she remembered him. He stood there for a long time. The staff told him what it would involve: specialized diet, a proper outdoor enclosure, regular veterinary care from someone with exotic animal experience, legal permits, because this wasn't a stray cat, this was a wild animal, and the state had rules about that. It was complicated, it was expensive, it was nothing like what he had planned. He said he wanted to move forward. The process took several weeks: paperwork, a home inspection, a permit application through the state wildlife agency. He built an enclosure in his backyard, larger than they required because he wanted her to have room. He read everything he could find, talked to the shelter staff, talked to a vet 2 counties over who had experience with wild felids. He was nervous the morning they brought her. She was quiet in the transport crate, watchful, not distressed. When they opened it inside the enclosure and stepped back, she didn't bolt. She moved slowly through the space, nose low, reading everything. Then she stopped and looked at him. That same look, calm, focused, direct. He hadn't planned any of this, but standing there in his backyard on a still morning, watching a bobcat move through the space he'd built for her, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, like something was beginning. The first weeks were humbling. He had done the research, read the books, talked to the experts, thought he was prepared. He wasn't. She wasn't aggressive, but she wasn't easy either. She moved on her own schedule, ate when she wanted, ignored him for hours, then appeared without warning at the edge of the enclosure, watching him work in the yard with that quiet, unreadable focus. Every time he thought he understood her, she reminded him that he didn't. There was no training her the way you train a dog. No commands. No rewards that worked consistently, no predictable behavior he could count on day to day, just patience, just showing up. Every morning he came out with her food and sat nearby while she ate, not crowding her, not pushing for contact, just being present, letting her get used to the sound of him, the rhythm of him, the fact that he always came back and never asked anything from her she wasn't ready to give. It took time, but slowly, something changed. She started moving toward him more often, not for food, just toward him. She would settle near the fence when he was working close by. Sometimes she would hold eye contact for long, unhurried moments that felt less like the watchfulness of a wild animal and more like something quieter than that, something closer to trust. The first time she pressed her head briefly against his hand through the fence, he didn't react, didn't make a sound, just stayed still and let it happen, and felt something tighten in his chest that he couldn't quite name. He called his daughter that evening, tried to describe it. She laughed a little, not unkindly, and said, "Dad, only you," and he laughed too. But after he hung up, he sat on the back porch in the dark and listened to the night sounds and felt, for the first time in a long time, like his life had a shape again, like it was moving toward something rather than just away from something else. She never became a house cat, never lost the thing that made her wild, but she had chosen a proximity to him that she didn't offer anyone else. A specific quiet closeness, on her terms, always on her terms, that somehow meant more because of that. He hadn't expected any of this. The work, the learning, the slow unfolding of something that had no name he could find in any book. But he showed up every morning. And every morning, she was there. Years passed. The enclosure weathered through seasons, the permits got renewed, the vet 2 counties over became familiar enough to ask about her by name. His backyard, once just a patch of grass behind a quiet house, became something else entirely. A place with purpose, a place that required him. He had built a routine again, not the hollow kind he'd been maintaining before, not the kind that just filled hours. A real one, grounded in care and presence, in the specific and daily work of tending to something that needed him in ways a dog never would have. She was older now, a little slower in the mornings. She still appeared at the edge of the enclosure when he came out, still watched him with that same focused, amber-eyed attention that had stopped him cold in a shelter hallway years ago. It hadn't changed, that look, that quality of seeing him that felt, every time, like something deliberate. He thought about that day often, the drive to the shelter, the list in his mind, the lab he'd almost taken home, the narrow hallway, the quiet enclosure at the back where a young bobcat sat completely still and watched a stranger approach and, for reasons no one could fully explain, did not look away. He hadn't been ready for any of what followed, the permits, the enclosure, the slow education and patience that she had given him without ever intending to. The phone calls to his daughter that started with "You won't believe what she did today." The neighbors who stopped at the fence sometimes, quietly amazed. The life that had quietly organized itself around something he never planned for. He understood now what he had actually been looking for that morning. Not a dog exactly, not just company or routine or something to fill the silence. Connection. Real connection. The kind that asks something of you. The kind that doesn't come easy and doesn't let you be lazy about it. The kind that shows up in unexpected forms if you're willing to stop long enough to notice. He had almost walked past her, had almost turned back at the end of that hallway and returned to the front desk and driven home with something safe and expected and fine. But he hadn't, and she had made sure of it. He sat on the back porch in the late afternoon light, the way he often did now, coffee going cold in his hand, watching her move slowly through the enclosure in that liquid, unhurried way of hers, and felt something he had learned, over these years, to simply receive: gratitude. Quiet, full, uncomplicated gratitude, for the life he hadn't planned.